Hey there, everyone. Welcome back to Utility Sports. Really excited for this video discussing the Toronto Raptors and taking a look at where they currently are and where they could potentially go through this NBA offseason. So this will be an offseason preview breaking down Toronto. There were quite a few comments requesting the Raptors in an offseason preview. So you'll see some of those flashing on the screen now. And I also just want to remind you, if there's another team you're wanting to see on the channel that I haven't recorded for already, leave a comment down below and I will definitely work toward getting to those teams. Of course, a lot of work goes into these videos, so if you do enjoy what we've been producing here at Utility Sports in terms of content and NBA coverage, make sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel for more, and then also turn that notification bell so you don't miss out on more future uploads here moving forward. So jumping into that video preview, we're going to start with a season recap. I think it's really important when we do these offseason previews to really deep dive into where this team currently is and what we just saw from them this past season, because it gives us a good idea of what they could be looking to add, what, in my opinion, they need to add, and then also just some realistic outcomes for what might happen in free agency when it comes to players possibly leaving. We'll talk about that quite a bit with the Raptors in this video. And then Masai Ujiri has a big question on his hands, and that's who is going to be the next head coach of the franchise after firing Nick Nurse. We'll talk about that head coaching search, look at some of the candidates that they already have interviews planned with or have interviewed by the time you're watching this video. We'll also see 2023 NBA draft content in here, whether that's lottery odds or prospects that fit Toronto at the pick that they're likely going to have in this year's draft. We'll talk about the odds on where they're going to be likely picking this year and then what they could look to do with that selection. Afterward, we're going to focus on NBA free agency, their cap space, and players that could potentially leave them in free agency. There's quite a few names on that list, so it's very important to talk about that for Toronto this offseason. We're then going to also look at some free agent targets for this Raptors team that I think that they need to make some moves. They need to definitely make some adjustments. And then there's really the big hovering question, something that I thought was maybe going to be addressed at the trade deadline. They actually pivoted, went a completely different way than I was expecting them to for what I thought was going to be for the betterment of the franchise. But now I want to know if there's trades looming or not. So we're going to talk about some of the players I could see Toronto move off of. Also, who knows, right? Toronto, they shook it up at the deadline, ended up making a buy move when I expected them to sell. So maybe they look to do that again this offseason. Now, I'm not saying I recommend that, but could they look to do that? We'll talk about my expectations for them when it comes to making some moves this offseason. And ultimately, all of those things together, everything we just discussed, will lead us into next year and what my early outlook is for this team, where I feel like they are ranked compared to other teams, and kind of the difficulties that they have this offseason maybe lends itself to a semi-disappointing year next year, but also they have some young guys, some internal development could also take them another step forward. So we're going to cover all of that in today's video, and let's get started with that season recap here. The team went 41-41, which is a pretty big disappointment compared to where the expectations were for this team before the season. Remember, Vegas set their odds before the season at 46.5 wins. So Vegas expected this team to be significantly better, much higher in the standings than 9th in the Eastern Conference. And to me, I understood some of the reasoning as to why, but I also was just naturally a little bit lower on this team than a lot of other people, because even though there are a lot of good players here, 5 really good players, I would argue, maybe you could vouch for a 6th on this team, there were some key issues on the squad. And part of it is they just didn't have enough offense, specifically shooting. This team just did not have any shooting. And I think Nick Nurse, who ended up getting canned at the end of the season, really had a tough group to try and do anything with in terms of winning games, because they entered the year without a consistent center. I know that for parts of the year, Christian Koloko stepped up big time for them, and they had some decent performances from kind of the combination of Precious Achiuwa, Chris Boucher, and Koloko throughout the beginning part of the year. But it was just a flawed roster coming into the season, and I know there were a lot of expectations, and yes, they do have some really good top-end talent, but it always felt like it just didn't fit perfectly. It wasn't like a perfect puzzle. And because of that, I think Nick Nurse had a really difficult job to try and figure out how to score with this team, which is something Nurse I think had more issues with than anything throughout his time as a coach, is the offensive end. Defensively, he's always very sound. You look at this year, they had a positive net rating, which is a good indicator that this team was still pretty solid despite their record not being very good. And it's because they finished 4th in opponents' points per game. And if you look at the roster, the way that Nick Nurse had them playing a very aggressive style of defense where they're looking for steals, they're looking for deflections, they're trying to create a lot of ball pressure and really speed teams up and get them to play at an uncomfortable pace. Nick Nurse's decisions there were very, very good. And because of that, it led the Raptors to having a very good defense, which is what you'd hope to see from a team that was built the way that it was. So I don't really think Nick Nurse deserved to get fired. I think that this is more of a Masai Ujiri trying to kind of change what's going on and kind of maybe just look for some difference in coaching style, which is fine. But at the end of the day, if you're Masai Ujiri, you're the one in charge of the roster, you have to give your coach a roster that you're going to be able to find some balanced success with. And I think Nurse was kind of limited in that way because his best offensive player is Pascal Siakam, who, everyone knows him for his spin move, but Spicy P is a very good player and somebody who has had an all-NBA season before and I think is an all-star level player. The issue, though, is I don't know if Pascal Siakam is like he should be a number one guy when it comes to half-court offensive creation for you. And Fred VanVleet, he stepped up big time this year too. I know that Raptors fans are pretty much completely off of him for his stock, but I still think VanVleet's a good player in this league. It's just, I think for Toronto, the issue with this team, especially offensively, is there's no fit. There's not a lot of spacing because you don't have a lot of shooting on the court. And you're asking a guy who, in my opinion, would be a really good number 2 option in Siakam to be your number 1 all the time. You're asking VanVleet, who I think would be a good 3rd or 4th offensive option, to be your number 2 option all the time. And then you're also tasking a guy with Scotty Barnes to learn a different position and play in a different style than he ever has before. And I don't think enough people on social media ever really understood that yes, he had kind of a disappointing sophomore season, but it's not because he got worse. It's because he's adjusting to a new way of playing and a new kind of role that's being asked of him because Nick Nurse didn't have other options, really. I don't think Nick Nurse ever trusted Malachi Flynn completely. And I just think ultimately the Raptors had challenges just with the way this team was built. Gary Trent Jr., OG Anunoby, both of them very good wings, but a little up and down when it comes to the perimeter shooting, which is fine. And the thing is, GTJ and OG, you don't need them to be lights out shooters. They can both knock it down. But I think like one knockdown shooter would have really opened this entire court for teams, for this team specifically, and made them very difficult to guard because you add someone who can move off the ball and generate attention and draw gravity that way. I think it would have really opened driving lanes and cutting lanes for this team in a way that they just didn't have open to them this year. But of course, they went in a different direction and traded for Jakob Poeltl, who is a very good player. And throughout last season, I said Jakob Poeltl is going to be a hot name at the trade deadline and a player that whoever gets him is going to be getting a really good player. The issue with Toronto is they needed him, but they also needed other stuff too, in my opinion. So the fact that they went out and got him, I don't think was bad for them. Now, the price point that they gave up at 2024 first, you could argue that there's some issues with that just simply because now they're a little limited. They can't trade their 2025 first. There's some protections on it. So it's just kind of a complicated situation on if you actually love the value on that deal or not. For me, I'm kind of apropos on it. We'll talk about Poeltl a little bit later as to why I'm a little unsure about it. But for Jakob, I think he's a fantastic player and is a fantastic actual fit defensively on this team, and rebounding wise, I think he's a very sound fit. They knew what they were getting with him. Obviously played for the franchise before, but with the absence of 3-point shooting, it just seemed like everything was kind of like running in mud all season long. And it just, it felt like they had to win a game like 98-97 to try and win. And not that you can't do that. And obviously I'm using some hyperbole there. It's not like they were scoring that low, but it just felt like it was like an absolute brawl every time that they had to try and win. And it felt like Nurse had to come up with some crazy full court press and, use some zones at weird times and stuff to try and figure out ways to generate some offense, honestly, because to be honest, without Gary Trent Jr. getting his hand on the basketball, Fred VanVleet, they had 3 guys in the top 10 in steals this year. Without that, this team would have been significantly worse offensively. I think transition basketball was very, very important for them, and they did find good success that way. but I just don't know if you want to rely on that going forward year in, year out. So I think this Raptors team does need to add some offense, specifically some perimeter shooting that can really knock it down either off the dribble or off the catch, which either way I think would be valuable for this team. So now as we go forward, we look at their head coaching search. And some of the candidates that they are either planning on interviewing or already have include Becky Hammon, the Las Vegas Aces head coach. Now, in an interview, or in her press conference, asked about this job, she said her focus is entirely on the Las Vegas Aces right now, but I don't necessarily believe that to be true. I think that's more like posturing for the media in a way to answer it, because kind of the timing of this whole situation. Kenny Atkinson, Golden State Warriors assistant coach, he's expected to be one of the odds-on favorites for this position. Of course, last year, remember, he had accepted a head coaching offer for the Charlotte Hornets and then backed out on that, making him return to Golden State as the top assistant after Mike Brown left for Sacramento. Therefore, Kenny Atkinson would be a pretty nice hire. He has head coaching experience. I think he understands what he wants to do stylistically. I think Jakob Poeltl would be a very nice fit for him with the type of center that Kenny Atkinson prefers to play. I think that it would work out pretty well there. Adrian Griffin, they are interviewing an in-house candidate here, Raptors assistant coach. We'll see if he gets the job. My guess is he's going to be one of the finalists for the Detroit Pistons position as well. Charles Lee, who is also pictured on the graphic here, Bucks assistant coach. Now, I know the Bucks didn't have the end of the season that they would have liked to, but Charles Lee has put together a pretty good resume as an assistant coach in his time with Mike Budenholzer in Milwaukee. And I think one thing about Charles Lee here is I think he's probably one of the stronger candidates this offseason who's never been a head coach before to land one of these positions, similar to where Darvin Ham was last year before being hired by the Los Angeles Lakers. I think a lot of people had the idea that, look, Darvin Ham's going to be a head coach in this league. It's just a matter of when, not if. I think Charles Lee's kind of in that same boat as of right now. Chris Quinn and Kevin Young, two assistant coaches on very successful teams, the Miami Heat and Phoenix Suns, both playing in the second round of the playoffs. I don't think that they'll actually get this position, but I think this is kind of the beginning of the routine here for both Quinn and Young to start getting more positions and just being more involved in interview processes and likely landing a head coaching job at some point down the road. Then Jordi Fernandez, Kings assistant coach. This is also a very interesting addition into their head coaching search. Of course, Jordi Fernandez joining Mike Brown's staff this year in Sacramento. Definitely a solid option here. But I think really the two names that you have to watch for this position, I think Kenny Atkinson is a strong possibility. And I also think Becky Hammon, if Masai Ujiri can go out and make history here with hiring the first women's head coach, or first woman head coach of the NBA, it would be very interesting to see how that plays out. And it would be definitely a strong move for a franchise located in a pretty accepting geography when it comes to moves like that. So we'll see what happens there with Becky, if she ends up becoming the head coach of the Toronto Raptors or not. But I do think she's going to have strong consideration. Remember, she spent time as an assistant coach with the San Antonio Spurs under Greg Popovich, so she does have some experience coaching in the NBA. So it's not like she's unqualified for the position. Then we go into our lottery odds here, and there's some teams that I think are important to talk about here for the Toronto Raptors, and just some odds that could really shake some things up here for the Raptors that I think would be very, very interesting. So you see their chances to move up into the top four, not very high. 1% chance to have the first overall pick and land Victor Wembanyama. He would completely transcend this franchise and change everything that we see about this team and just completely shift our perception on where the Raptors are heading long term. He would be such a good addition. Obviously, I don't have to spend too much time on that. You guys know how impactful Victor could potentially be, but I think Toronto would be a team that would really, really, really benefit by getting him with where their franchise is currently pointing and where they would end up turning to if they got him. Scoot Henderson would also be a fantastic fit for this team if they moved up to second, because they do have some pending free agents that we're going to talk about later on in this video. So I just want to keep your minds occupied on Scoot Henderson when we get to that spot of the video. But more than likely, this team is going to be picking 13th overall. You see the odds there for them to be picking 13th is nearly 93%. So if we were to run the draft lottery 100 times, 93 of the times basically Toronto would pick 13th overall. So I don't want to be a buzzkill here. It's not very likely the Raptors move up. It's not impossible either. We've seen crazy things happen. Think about when the Chicago Bulls moved up for Derrick Rose. So crazy things can happen. Is it possible Toronto could land Victor Wembanyama in this year's draft? It is possible. Could they land, even a Brandon Miller would be an awesome fit for them. Amen Thompson would be an interesting swing on upside for this team. But realistically, I see them picking 13th just because that's what the odds really tell me here. Because out of all of the teams in the lottery, 13th and 14th, the teams that barely miss the playoffs are like the worst spot to be in the NBA, because it means you didn't play in the postseason really. But it also means that you don't have very good odds to actually move up in the draft compared to, say, the team with the 10th or 9th best odds. Look at Utah. There's like a 20% chance they move up, whereas for Toronto, there's like a 5% chance they move up, which is a pretty drastic change from being the 9th worst team in the league to the 13th worst team in the league, in my opinion. So as we transition forward into some of those NBA draft prospects that do make some sense at pick number 13, I think it's really important to note that, first of all, Masai Ujiri, even though I can continue to sit here and say, look, I think that they need to add shooting and shooting should be a top priority for them, it's possible Masai Ujiri just feels differently. And so far with some of his team building, it seems for the most part that he does feel differently than that. There's not a lot of times that this team has really prioritized shooting for a key role player, for a key guy that's in their rotation. They typically like to go with length, athleticism, and size, which is understandable. And those things obviously do benefit this team as well in terms of winning and building a good defense and being competitive. But to me, it's been a flaw on their roster building, but it's possible that Masai Ujiri is just on a completely different wavelength than me. And I wanted to account for that here with some of the guys that I included for prospects. Cason Wallace, combo guard from Kentucky. Again, you're not drafting him for his shooting, you're drafting him for his overall play. He's a very competitive player. He's an absolute dog on the defensive end of the court. I think he's very, very smart and intuitive defensively, which are things that you just can't really teach. So the fact that he has good instincts and is able to be a smart rotation defender as a guard is something that not a lot of other guards in this class offer, which makes Cason Wallace a very intriguing fit here for Toronto. GG Jackson would be kind of like that surprise Masai Ujiri's, pulling something out of his hat that no one expects type of pick. I don't think GG Jackson's a good fit onto this current team, but I do think that the upside is there, that maybe Masai Ujiri, if he falls in love with him in the draft process, would say, well, to hell with fit, I don't really care. We're going to take GG Jackson because I think he's good. And, that would really shake up a lot of things. So far, I think I've only mocked GG Jackson to Toronto one time this entire draft process. And the reason for that is because I think Masai Ujiri is capable of pulling the trigger on something that he has belief in, because he is a very forceful GM when it comes to trusting his gut. So if he likes GG Jackson, I wouldn't completely rule it out. Remember, that's kind of the same style of player he's fallen in love with in the past. He really liked Giannis Antetokounmpo. Of course, Pascal Siakam he saw as a nice long-term piece for him. So, I mean, GG Jackson kind of fits the bill of what he would look to do in the past. That's what he's looked to do. But GG Jackson, to me, is just a different player and a guy that I don't think fits right now, but I wouldn't rule it out. The two players who I really like for this team, and it's the two players who I think I would strongly consider at this spot, is Grady Dick, 6'8" wing from Kansas, who can really, really shoot the ball. He's also a pretty smart cutter, someone who's going to crash the offensive glass pretty well. To me, he's a significantly better prospect than Jordan Hawkins, but Jordan Hawkins is probably the best off-ball offensive shooter in this class. He's got so many repetitions running off of staggers and pin downs and flares, and just playing without the ball in his hands, trying to generate looks for himself. Plus, at times for UConn, he did step into that role where he was doing some stuff with the rock. Now, I think he's a significantly worse player with the ball in his hands than he is without it, which I think is fine, because if you're looking at Toronto and trying to build around Barnes and Siakam, you're going to need guys who are better without the ball than they are with it, which is why Jordan Hawkins, I think, does make a lot of sense here still for Toronto. I think 13 feels just a little high to me in this draft, just because I think Hawkins has some serious flaws in his game, especially when it comes to playing through and around contact at the rim. I think that there's really no star upside potential for Jordan Hawkins. I know some people continue to float that idea out there. I just don't see that in any capacity, but I do think he's going to be a really nice movement shooter and still a player that would help this team significantly with one of their greatest flaws in roster building. Nick Smith Jr., I don't think will be on the board at pick 13. To me, he's likely a top 11 pick in this year's draft, but Based on the medicals, he could slide just a little bit. There are some questions about that knee that he missed time for this year for Arkansas, if there's going to be long-term ramifications of anything with that. Of course, dealing with that kind of knee soreness, knee stuff that he was going through, it raises some questions. And I don't have the medicals myself, which is why this is purely speculative. I don't want to create some narrative out there on Nick Smith Jr. I think he's a fantastic player. He's got fantastic touch and would be a really good addition to this Raptors team moving forward if they needed to add a player into that backcourt, which I think is a real possibility, which is also why I have Keontae George and Jalen Hood-Schifino here. George, to me, a little bit more of a combo guard, a little bit more bench spark plug type player who can get his own shot off and likes going right and left, can shoot going both ways, and is growing as a passer, whereas Jalen Hood-Schifino, I think, is a little bit further along as a passer, a little bit better command of an NBA offense at this point, I think. More reliable in a pick and roll type of passer playmaking decision, but he's also got a really nice mid-range jump shot that he likes stepping into about 14 to 18 feet. So I think JHS could be a nice addition for Toronto as well. Really, this was one of my favorite teams to talk about when it comes to the NBA draft because there's a lot of variety of options, and I think Masai Ujiri always keeps us on our toes a little bit. Back when they took Scotty Barnes, I consistently had mocked Barnes to the Raptors, and I thought that was an A+ move for them when they took him. So I'm not completely left guessing here, but I do think that there are a variety of options that Masai and the Raptors would consider at this spot. So going forward here into NBA free agency, this team is projected to have negative cap space at negative $6.3 million. And Fred VanVleet has a player option, which would lead him going toward unrestricted free agency. Gary Trent Jr. has a player option going to unrestricted free agency. Both those two will decline their player options. I would be 100% stunned if they were to actually opt into their deals. And then Jakob Poeltl, remember, a couple months after trading for him, also is now heading toward unrestricted free agency, which is one of the big issues I had with the value that they gave up for him. Is now, without an extension done, you're at a spot where you have to try and re-sign Jakob Poeltl against the market. And his agent knows this and is probably going to ask for a significant amount of money so that the Raptors don't simply lose him for nothing after trading a first-round pick that they still owe for him, which is part of the issue I have. And it led to no playoff basketball in Toronto, which honestly, if they lost Poeltl for nothing and then ultimately didn't make the playoffs with him and still owe a draft pick, it's like worst case scenario there. Now, I don't think that's going to happen. I think Jakob Poeltl is going to be one of the main pieces that they like to keep this offseason for their free agency targets. I think that it's pretty simple that they're going to be looking for specific traits after retaining Jakob Poeltl. That's the first step. Keep Jakob Poeltl. Then afterward, with the assumption that they likely lose Fred VanVleet and or Gary Trent Jr., I could see one of the two staying. I don't think it's very likely that both of them stick in Toronto, though. So because of that, I think Toronto's going to have some money that opens up here and a non-taxpayer mid-level exception to go address some things that they need. Shooting, ball handling. I think that there's one player out there that does make quite a bit of sense to open up this court for the Toronto Raptors in a way that they just currently don't have. And then I also think there's some big men who can space the floor a little bit too that could play off of Poeltl, off of Siakam, and give you a kind of variety of lineups that Nick Nurse just didn't really have the options to run with this year. So hopefully the next coach has those potential pathways to kind of play a little bit looser and have a variety of rotations that he actually trusts on the court. So looking at those targets, first one that really jumps out to me, Kevin Love, I think would be a really nice fit next to Jakob Poeltl as kind of a four-man who can space the court. Obviously, he's still a good rebounder, one of the better breakout passers in NBA history. But really, you're signing him for two reasons, and I've said this in a lot of the videos. He slides in to take charges. I think this gives the Raptors a different layer of rim protection in a completely different fashion than what Jakob Poeltl brings. Poeltl's a very good vertical challenger. He doesn't block a ton of shots, but he challenges at the rim. Kevin Love doesn't necessarily do that, but he punishes players who drive out of control. And he slides in, he takes a ton of charges. He took the second most charges in the NBA this season. So because of that, I think he's going to give them a completely different style of paint defense and just overall team defensive help that Nick Nurse didn't have last year. That, again, I'm hoping this new coach that they hire has that in their arsenal going forward. And then the other player I really like for them in terms of ball handling and shooting and spacing the floor here quite a bit is Seth Curry from the Brooklyn Nets. I think that he's going to be very affordable. Probably will sign somewhere around the 3-year, $18 million mark, if I had to guess. Maybe a little bit less than that. I could see 2 years, 12 being an option too, kind of with either a player option on there or a team option, depending on how teams are viewing him this offseason. But at $6 million, a guy like Seth Curry, who's a career 40+% three-point shooter with a lot of range, the ability to handle the ball a little tiny bit in the pick and roll, and just kind of gives you this like hybrid guard who can do a little bit with the ball in his hands. I think he's underrated in that element, but also we just know if you leave him open, he's going to knock it down. And I think the Raptors, again, we haven't seen Masai Ujiri do this, and I think he needs to at some point. We just need to see him commit to having a good shooter on the roster that you expect to be in the top 8 rotation and play every single night. And I think Seth Curry can be that guy. You know, people are going to point to Matt Thomas. Okay, this is completely different. This is someone we would expect to play 20 minutes a game. And if you have somebody like that, I just think everyone else on the roster is benefited. I think Scotty Barnes would be like, oh my gosh, the paint's actually open a little bit this game. He would be probably shocked. I think OG Anunoby would be benefited. Pascal Siakam definitely would be as well. And just the overall play style offensively of this team would feel like we're not in a swamp anymore, which is the whole goal of signing a guy like Seth Curry, in my opinion. So when we move forward here into potential trades, I don't really see the Raptors being big buyers just with what's already been sent out the door. I think kind of doubling down on this roster would be an interesting decision. And I do think with the way the postseason is going to play out here, a lot of teams going to lose and be disappointed with where they currently are. Some big names could be on the move potentially for massive packages. I look at the Memphis Grizzlies as a team looking to buy. I think the New Orleans Pelicans will be very interested in buying, as well as some of these other teams that get knocked out of the playoffs before they would like to. I think it opens the door to Pascal Siakam being one of the, if not the biggest name on the market and probably one of the most sought after players just because he plays at a premium position in the NBA. He's a skilled player with size and length who can play in a variety of ways for you, good as a passer and as a slasher. And then OG Anunoby, of course, we know last trade deadline, there was a ton, and I mean a ton of interest around the league for teams looking to potentially add OG Anunoby into their roster. And ultimately, Toronto decided to not go that route and trade off of OG Anunoby. I think that those discussions are maybe going to reopen this offseason, so we'll see if ultimately Masai Ujiri makes a move surrounding OG Anunoby or not, but I think that they could get massive value for him and kind of reshuffle the deck with what they've got. And I think, again, like I love OG Anunoby as a player, but let's say you go into free agency, you decide, hey, we'll keep Gary Trent Jr., we have Scotty Barnes, Pascal Siakam. That's kind of our 2, 3, 4 of the future with Poeltl. And then maybe you have some money then to go out and get a point guard. Otherwise, you have all of these assets you get for Anunoby to find a point guard, and you kind of have rebalanced your roster and addressed some of those needs that I think this team has. Yes, it hurts giving up a player like OG who's really good and honestly defensively one of the better defensive playmakers in the league while also being a pretty good sit down and guard type of player. So it hurts moving him. And I understand that, you know, people have seen the all-star potential in him, and if he stays healthy, stays on the court, maybe he gets there at some point. But if you can get 3 or 4 first-round picks for a guy who has not been an all-star at this point, it feels like really good value, and it gives the Raptors a lot of flexibility that right now they just don't have as much of, which I think is really one of the most important things when we talk about teams in the offseason. And just throughout the duration of a franchise, you want to have more flexibility than any other team, because it means when something goes wrong, you can pivot off of that. When something goes right, you can add to it. And because of that, I think moving OG Anunoby would maybe be smart for Toronto, as long as it's for the right price point. I'm not just saying trade him to trade him. I'm saying if you get really great value and something that you think you can do something with later on, you make the deal, is what I'm saying here. Siakam, a little bit more of a different discussion. I think that's more difficult to trade him just because he's reached higher levels of success individually than OG. So because of that, I don't really see it likely. But I mean, even if they did trade Siakam and kept OG Anunoby, I wouldn't really hate that either. It kind of moves Scotty Barnes back to the position he should naturally be playing, in my opinion, anyway. So because of that, I think it's not a terrible outcome, but ultimately we'll see what the Raptors look to do this offseason. So an early outlook, I think a lot could change in Toronto from the time I'm recording this video. Remember, as of right now, the starting lineup would look like Fred VanVleet, Gary Trent Jr., OG Anunoby, Pascal Siakam, Scotty Barnes, and Jakob Poeltl. I know I named 6 players there. I could see any 5 of those 6 guys starting and being good starters. And you might say, how does a team who has 6 good starting level players not win a ton of games? It's because, again, the fit. So if they don't make any moves, I think they're going to be about what they are this year, maybe a little bit better, just because naturally you're going to take a small step forward with a new head coaching hire, because teams don't have scouting information on you. And as long as they instill a good offensive scheme, you have an advantage over the competition, because they don't have your information. They don't know what you're trying to do for, say, the first 30 or 40 games of the year, until, you know, they've really ironed out what you're doing, and then you've also ironed out what you're doing. So I think there is a benefit there to a coaching change for early season success. But at the same time, I just don't really think that this team becomes a team that's going to win a bunch of playoff series in the East, with the way that the East is currently shaping out to look for the next couple of years. And with the way this roster is currently built, I just don't think it's a fit. Now, if they make some of the right moves and choose some of the guys that they want to keep, and some that they move off of, and kind of reshuffle the cards, so to speak, the Raptors could be a much better team. And they could be a team that maybe does win some series in the Eastern Conference if they add shooting, if they add a little bit more athleticism, and a little bit more shot creation off the guard spots. Those are the things I think they're lacking, and I think if they address them, they could be much better. I also wouldn't be shocked that if they make some moves, they take a step back, and that's completely fine too, as long as they continue to value their own draft picks and look to really focus on internal development. I think that this team's very reliant on internal development moving forward, just because at pick 13, you're going to probably get a good player, but it's not a player who's going to change your season overnight. So I think that you need to find ways to internally progress, and I think Scotty Barnes, everyone's looking at him as the guy to do it, but I think that it's on the shoulders of everybody on the roster to you know, get reps in from behind the 3-point line, to work on dribble, pass, and shoot, and get more comfortable playing through and around contact and playing off of 2 feet for some of these guys. I think would be good. I think Pascal Siakam would be really benefited by that. So, you know, there's a lot of ways this team could improve. A lot of people love to put down the hammer and say this team's never going to win anything. I don't like to do that very much. Now, if you inject me with truth here, I might probably say I don't bet on the Raptors winning a championship in the next 5 years, but that doesn't mean that the door is closed tight on them and it's impossible. And it doesn't mean that this team is stuck in mediocrity or anything like that. There's ways out of this. There's ways that they can look to improve this team and take marginal steps forward. That over time, if you take small step by small step, it ends up being a big change and a big difference. So I'm hoping for that for the Raptors this offseason, that they start that progress and that process correctly. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you did enjoy this Toronto Raptors offseason preview. It was a lot of fun to record, a lot of fun to talk about the Toronto Raptors, who I know Raptors fans, very, very passionate fan base. So if you stuck around to this point of the video, huge props to you. I really appreciate you for taking time to watch this video. Make sure to go check out some of the other content on the channel as well. And if you did really enjoy this video, make sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel for more, and then hit that notification bell so you're notified every time I upload a brand new video. Thanks again, guys, so much for watching, and we'll catch you in the very next Utility Sports video.